Christian Smith, I think the first thing that I should say to you is congratulations, because I'm seeing your book everywhere. There was a symposium in Christianity Today that I read last night in preparation for our conversation. You've been on the Russell Moore podcast. You've been, like I say, kind of everywhere, at least everywhere in my small world and small circle, which is uh, kind of an accomplishment for an academic writing a 400 pretty dense 400-page book with a lot of charts and graphs in it. So does that reception surprise you?
Well, first of all, thank you. I'm glad to be getting out there in the world. And not particularly. I write books that are not just for my fellow, scholars, but even more so for thoughtful, well-educated people in the world. And it is a bit of a long book to get through, but I think there's also a large audience that's interested in these things. So there's a lot of people that care about it, and so they're willing to, try to hear the argument.
Well, I think that's right, and I know I would certainly count myself in that category. I don't know about well-educated or intelligent, but certainly interested in what you're up to with this project. And I will echo Russell Moore when he said that there was just a whole lot to like about this book and to be fascinated by, but also a lot that was kind of scary and frustrating and not necessarily hopeful. And there's I despair of being able to cover the entire book in the 30, 35, or 40 minutes that we have, Christian. So let me just kind of stipulate for the record something that has been in the water for a long time that you document magnificently in your book, and that is that religion is on the decline. Institutional religion is on the decline. Confidence in the rise of the nuns, as it has been so called, has been going on for a number of years. So rather than recount the couple or ask you to recount the couple of chapters that you devote to that phenomenon, let's just stipulate for the record that that is so. And anybody that wants to see the charts and the graphs and the data can read your book. The thing that I'm most interested in, though, is when that happened and sort of the why and the how that happened. And you point to 1991 as a pivotal year. I think a lot of people might say 9/11. A lot of people might say the rise of social media, the iPhone being introduced in 2007, whatever. But your year 1991 caught me a little by surprise. Can you explain why that year is so significant?
Yeah, so as you say, I mean, we've got well documented religions on decline. This book is trying to explain why and how that happened. My argument is that it's a result of a lot of long-term social, technological, political, economic changes that happened over quite a period of time. It wasn't one event, it was a whole lot of events. I call them converging perfect storms. 1991, I don't say everything happened. I say that's kind of a hinge year or a pivot year where we moved from one era into another. And so, yeah, social media, the internet, 9/11, all that contributed. But what happened in 1991 was the beginning of what I call the millennial zeitgeist. The biggest clue I started with is that's when the number of Americans who on surveys said they were not religious began to rise. Previous to then, forever, as long as we've been taking surveys, only about 6 or 7% of Americans said they were not religious. Starting in 1991, it bumped up, and every year since then, it's been rising. A lot more happened though since then. There were changes in culture, changes in music. The World Wide Web was launched that year. Of course, it took a long time well, actually not that long. It took a while for, it to become popularly used. But in the book, I lay out a whole series of things that happened in that year that, again, it didn't change everything, but it sort of opened up a new era. And in the next 2 decades, a whole onslaught of changes came in that I think really harmed traditional religion.
So that was one of the surprises, I guess you could say, that I found in your book, because I guess maybe in my own naive thinking, not as an expert in these matters, would look at things like um, the advent of the internet and social media. I've read, Gene Twenge and others who sort of, point to 2007, 2008 as kind of that pivotal year. So that was an interesting learning for me, and one that I found convincing. I mean, your argument for me at least was convincing. The other idea that I wanted you to unpack for me just a little bit, is an idea from the title of your book, Why Religion Went Obsolete.
Mhm.
I think obsolete conjures up a whole lot of negative connotations. I mean, what do you mean religion is obsolete? I still go to church every Sunday,
Yeah.
but then you talk about. Well, let me just ask you, what do you mean by obsolete? Explain that.
Yeah, so I intentionally chose this word. Most people that discuss these topics use the word decline, and that's true too. But decline points us to organizational metrics like number of people who are in a denomination or individual demographic things like do you believe in God or how often do you pray. In my book, I'm really trying to get at more the cultural level, the big macro zeitgeist level, and the word obsolete struck me as sort of capturing what was going on. Obviously, by obsolete, I mean what we normally mean, which is something that was previously used or important or relied upon for most people, not everybody, but for most people. And again, when I talk about people here, this book is focused on post boomers, Gen Xers, but especially millennials and now Gen Zers. Most people decide, or just it happens in their life that it gets used less, it seems less useful, less relevant. Something else comes along that puts it out of business, so to speak, or that puts it just less thought of or less considered to be used. So some of the images I draw on are, I learned how to type on electric typewriter and it worked great. And I could still use one if I needed to, but along come PCs, desktops, and laptops, and the electric typewriter goes obsolete. We could think
Right.
of lots and lots of examples. But what I like about obsolete is it doesn't mean something has gone extinct. There can be plenty of it still around. There's still electric typewriters in my house. I still have CDs, even though they're not sold anymore and they're not as easy as streaming. So yeah, there are still religious people, clearly, even if it's been on the decline. And for some people, it means something. The other thing about obsolete is it doesn't necessarily imply that the new thing is better than the old thing.
Mm.
In music, vinyl records actually have better sound fidelity than streaming music does. And yet, for other reasons, both the industry pushed something that they wanted, and it's just a lot easier to stream music than to get a big vinyl record. Vinyl records are obsolete. At the same time, my son-in-law has vinyl records he listens to. So it doesn't mean extinct. It doesn't mean useless. It doesn't even necessarily mean failed. It means something else has come along and displaced it. And that's what I mean by the millennial zeitgeist.
Well, and it becomes some sort of a niche as well. I mean, horse and buggy still exist, but
Mhm.
they exist among an elite or collector or among the Amish or whoever it might be.
Yeah,
So
and the other key point that you just implication of what you just said is people can still use obsolete things. It just becomes more difficult. There are fewer supports, there's fewer technology to support it. It requires more intentionality, more commitment to make it work.
well, and that was I'm glad you said that because that was where I was going to pivot next. Is that like using a typewriter, for example, you've got to find those ink cartridges or
Mhm,
those ribbons that go in there, and that there are more cultural barriers. You can't
mhm,
go down to the store and buy
mhm.
those like you can buy toner cartridges now at the local office
Yeah.
max. So, which brings me to this point. You talk a lot about culture as well. You say that culture, and I think you even use the language deep culture is
Mm.
a really important sort of underlying force in the obsolescence or in the ongoing or the progressive obsolescence of traditional religion. Can you say more about culture and its importance?
Yeah, so the argument of the book is that the causes of a lot of the forces were not about culture. They're technological, institutional, economic, political, and so on, but they show up in culture. They have cultural consequences. So I have a whole section explaining what I mean by culture, but what I mean by deep culture are those assumptions, presuppositions, beliefs, sensibilities that people don't even pay attention to because they're so common, they're so taken for granted, they just sort of govern people's lives without people realizing it. And so we're not talking about arguments with atheists about is it possible to believe in God or does the church do anything for society? We're talking about much deeper things about what is the purpose of life? Where do we learn reliable knowledge? Is there such thing as truth? What is the role of science? Who can you trust? What is an authority in life? These are very deep cultural matters, and most people don't think about them too much. They just sort of go with the flow or react to them. And so once the deep culture gets set in a way that's not even anti-religious, but it just mismatches religion, it just doesn't connect with it or fit with it. Once those deep culturals get put in place, tons of people can drift away and have drifted away from religion um, without it even being an intellectual or doctrinal or ethical concern. It just doesn't fit their lives.
Yeah. Yeah. Back in the day, I used to work in for some management and leadership consulting companies, and there was a man named Edgar Schein that did a lot of work on organizational development and organizational culture, and he defined culture specific to that environment as beliefs, behaviors, and assumptions that result in success, either
Mm,
social or financial success within that group of people, within that tribe or whatever you want to call it. And you devote some energy talking about how religion is perceived by people.
mhm,
In other words, and specifically, is it a cultural good? Is it a
mm,
social good? Is being a religious adherent positive for me? Will it open up social doors or financial or economic doors for me? Or is it a stigma and will it hold me back? And one of the conclusions that you arrived at is that increasingly, especially among millennials and Gen Z, religion, Christianity in particular, is not perceived as a cultural good. First of all, do I have you right in that? And can you
yeah,
say more
that's
about
right.
it?
That's right. I mean, one of the chapters I lay out, what based on our research and lots of data across my career, actually, how most Americans perceive religion, what that most Americans think religion is good for. It turns out most Americans think religion is good for things that are very imminent, this worldly, pragmatic, sort of make life here on earth better. Um, it helps people be moral. It helps them make good choices. It gives them ways of coping with life's difficulties. It gives them local community, things like that. And I mean, the first observation is that's not what a lot of traditional religions would say they're really, really good for. That's not what they're
Right,
about. You can get
right.
that from a lot of places. But that's what most Americans have come to think. And so once you get those assumptions in places, part of my argument is that as the world around religion changed, and then some things happened within religion, such as religious scandals. People decided, well, you don't need religion to accomplish those good things, or religion has actually violated the things we used to think it was good for, and that contributed to its obsolescence. So, yeah, there's a gap. Another way to say that one point is there's a big gap between what I think the demand by most Americans is out of religion and what most clergy and denominations and religious traditions think they want to be supplying to people.
Right. Well, I want to come back to that idea in just a moment, but before I do, there's another big idea in your book that I would like for you to say something about, and that is the idea of neoliberal capitalism. You
Mhm.
spend a fair amount of time, especially early in the book, but then after you lay that foundation, um, uh, it recurs throughout the book about neoliberal capitalism. Can you say what you mean by that and why you think that's so important to your arguments and thesis and to the overall project here?
Yeah, so to really lay this out is a big long story, but the short version is, after the Great Depression and World War II, the Western economies were much more governed by state intervention, Keynesianism, welfare states, and so on. And then starting in the 70s, but really coming to fruition in the 80s, was what we call neoliberal capitalism, which neo means the new liberal, referring back to the 19th century. Neoliberal capitalism, you can associate it with the Reagan Revolution, Thatcherism, and so on. Is like get the state out of things, reduce regulations, have more market competition, the government gets in the way. And then that eventually in the 90s was globalized with globalization. The consequences of all of that huge change in the economic system was for millennials. No longer was a career or work or occupation something you could find a job and kind of work the rest of your life, be loyal to the company, and then retire, pay off your mortgage. It was much more fluidity, transience, changing jobs, technology was changing, needing to upgrade, mobility, competition. And so millennials grew up in a world where, in the economic realm, they felt they couldn't settle. So traditional religion is a very is much associated in Americans' minds with settling down, being part of your community, getting into your neighborhood. Um, Neoliberal capitalism made it for millennials. Well, I can't settle down. First of all, I can't even afford a house anymore. I got student debt. But aside from that, I may get transferred. I may have to go to a new program. I may have to upgrade my skills. I need to spend this weekend working on my resume, et cetera, et cetera. So it introduced into the culture, from an economic system to the culture, it introduced a mentality of mobility, transience, instability, competition, which inadvertently, it was unintentional, but it had the effect of keeping, among many other factors, keeping young people from sort of settling in, getting involved, becoming members, and getting committed.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that you said earlier, Christian, that I want to remind our listeners of right now is that it's not one thing, but it's everything kind of
Yeah.
combined that caused this obsolescence of traditional religion. And one of the things that you just alluded to there was that young people, Gen Z, millennials, younger people, shall we say, other than me, I'm a baby boomer, they're staying in school longer. They're getting married later. They're having fewer children. They're moving more than they did in the past. And so these are, as you say, they're all contributors. And we don't have time to unpack all of that, except to say that I find the way you sort of portray the nexus of these forces to be absolutely fascinating in the book. And some of them are one of the things that I especially found fascinating. I'd like for you to talk a little bit more about this. Is that if you think about the folks that are either intentionally or inadvertently adhering to neoliberal capitalism, you might say that in some cases they're social conservatives.
Mm.
In many cases, in other words, let me just stick a pin in that data point, and then over here, the traditional mainline churches, which you document as being most precipitously in decline,
Mm.
you make the point that in some ways they're the victims of their own success.
Mhm.
That sort of the tolerant pluralistic values of mainline Protestantism have become the values of American culture. Therefore,
Mhm.
the mainline Protestantism becomes redundant. It becomes
Yeah.
sort of unnecessary to people that want to explore the worldview of tolerance and pluralism. It's baked into the culture already. We don't need you anymore,
Mhm.
mainline
Yeah.
Protestant. So I guess my point is that in some ways, both of these traditions, both the social conservatives and the mainline traditionalists, are in some ways um, victims of their own ideologies or their own successes in the culture. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, that's a fair assessment. The way someone like me as a sociologist would think about it is what does an organization or a tradition have to offer people that's distinctive that everyone else isn't offering? You can even think about this in marketing terms, like what's our product and why does anyone want to buy this instead of something else? I don't want to reduce religion to that, but so in mainline Protestantism, as you just described, like the cultural success, people believe, except for maybe the God part, the general, tolerance, acceptance, reason, etc. That's gone mainstream. So the cultural success has made it organizationally irrelevant. Like, why do I need to dress up and go to mainline Protestant church if there's not much extra there that I want? Evangelicalism for a long time had an edge of something different. And in the 70s, I think evangelicalism really thrived off of the United States was going through a time of upheaval in family and family relationships and sexuality. And evangelicalism offered a kind of a stability. You could go to an evangelical church, have family reaffirmed, traditional family values sort of reaffirmed. But then I think where things went off there was evangelicalism, as I write later in the book, got way too bought into Republican or conservative politics, and it sort of poisoned its own well with a whole set of people, especially younger people. I don't want to get into politics here, but just sociologically, it's sort of the rise of the Christian right, along with a lot of scandals related to televangelists and so on, really evangelicalism undermined itself in those ways.
Yeah. As I said earlier, Christian, I really despair of being able to unpack all of the ideas in this book, but so I'm going to have to kind of pivot on some of these ideas and say that to our listeners, if you want to explore them more deeply, get the book, read the book. I found it to be an absolutely fascinating and in many ways nourishing read. But I want to ask you to answer what I imagine might be some critics of some of the ideas in your book, sort of, so play gentle devil's advocate, because for the
Sure.
most part, I pretty much agree with everything that's in your book. But one would be as you said earlier, you're focusing mostly on millennials and Gen Z and contrasting them with baby boomers. Let me ask you this. But isn't it true, Christian Smith, that as people get older, they get more religious and get more conservative? That if you had interviewed boomers 40 years ago, you would have found a profile very similar to the Gen X's and millennials that you are now contrasting with the boomer profile today. What's wrong with that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the answer is that used to be true, but it isn't anymore, at least up till today. I'm not in the business of predicting the future. Lots of things can happen in the future, but in the chapter where I lay out all the data about what's happened, what's very clear is that silent generation, older boomers and younger boomers, even if they thought, complained in the 60s that religion wasn't relevant or whatever, as a group, the older they got, the more religious they got. And we came to expect that to be sort of a universal pattern. That stopped happening with Gen Xers, and it absolutely stopped happening with millennials as a generation. They got older, they did not become more religious. So things
Well,
have
let me push back on that just a little bit. How do we really know that? Because they're still fairly young, right?
Well, millennials are no, I'm the oldest millennials are now in their early 50s. So,
Yeah.
and they have
Okay. Fair
children,
enough.
etc. Gen Zers are fairly young, so they're a wild card here. But we have survey data over many generations. We know when people were born. We know which generation they're in. We can track as a population how religious they are. And there was an absolute, definite, clear on multiple measures end of the expectation that well they'll get older, have children, and become more religious. That's
Yeah.
changed. The other difference that's changed is, you alluded to it earlier, the demographics have changed. Many more young people are not getting married. They're cohabiting. They just live with roommates, or they're delaying marriage by 10 years now, or they're voluntarily not having children, or they're having children much later in life. Those basic demographic factors have huge implications for traditional religion, which historically has served your traditional family, two biological parents with children. The underlying demographics have changed in a plate tectonic way that has huge consequences.
Yeah. Well, let me again hit you with another sort of devil's advocate question. I've got a friend who says there's no such thing as a postmodern airplane pilot, that all airplane pilots believe in some sort of absolute truth, like gravity, for example, in Bernoulli's principle, for
Mhm.
example. And I do wonder how you would respond to this. Yes, traditional religion is obsolete, it's in decline, but human beings are social creatures. That's a fundamental part of who they are. And just because the mainline traditional religions are in decline, maybe even the evangelical church, which has maybe started out as a reaction to mainline, but has become sort of institutionalized itself. Maybe that's in decline. Human beings will not tolerate the void of no traditional religion. Something will replace it. Gravity always wins. Human
Mm.
nature will out in the end. How do you respond to that?
I completely agree with that. I've written that argument in multiple books. As a preliminary, I should say, postmodernism has had a huge effect, ethic, relativism, and so on. It's had a huge effect in culture. And the thing is, people are not rationally consistent and very philosophical, so they can be profoundly influenced by postmodernism. Get in an airplane and say, "I believe in science. I believe in the absolute truth of physical laws of the universe." People don't, it doesn't all have to all add up. And one of the features of the millennial zeitgeist is it doesn't have to add up. In fact, everything that was consistent became suspicious as there's something wrong with it. So, but that's just the background. The foreground is, yeah, human beings are not, secular atheism is going to appeal to a very small part of the population. There's an impulse for meaning, for larger significance, for the sacred, for things spiritual. And what I argue in the book is, that's absolutely happening. There's a huge movement underway, but it's not going to traditional religion. Younger people are going to what I call re-enchanted culture, involving monism instead of dualism, impersonal gods, the goddesses. There's this whole sphere that I call a culture, not the occult, but the things hidden, of hidden knowledge. We're talking about paganism, neo-paganism. We're talking about Wicca. We're talking about certain versions of the spirituality. A lot of people, spiritual but not religious. Some that doesn't really mean much, but for some that means a lot. Everything, vampire cultures, magic, it's all over the media too. Just think about everything from The Exorcist to Harry Potter to Stephen King. Like our culture is moving in the direction away from traditional religion, not to becoming secular, but to becoming re-enchanted, interested in magic. I'm sure you've heard of manifesting, the laws of attraction, the number of the market in crystals and energy and body energy and alternative healing. All of this is a whole different world than traditional Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. That's the growth industry right now. That's where not all, but many younger people are heading, who most intensely feel the need for some larger significance and meaning.
Let me ask you this, because I hear that, and when I read that chapter, I found that to be particularly fascinating, and the numbers scary and compelling in terms of supporting your argument.
Mm.
However, I also see another movement, even within Christianity. I think about books like Charles Taylor's A Secular Age, where he talks about this idea of enchantment and re-enchantment, and I see movements within Christianity, even within evangelicalism, but of folks, young people, becoming Anglican, becoming Orthodox, converting to Catholicism because it gives them a sense of both beauty and mystery that they have found missing from either their secular milieu or even the sort of low church evangelical milieu where Sunday services are a rock concert and a TED talk, as the old joke goes. Do you see that as a possibility for the reinvigoration of religion? This idea that the church itself will realize that they have jettisoned some of these notions of mystery and enchantment, and rather than young people turning to Wicca, they might return to a Christianity that more emphasizes mystery and beauty.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Here's my answer. Again, I'm not in the business of predicting the future. History is full of surprises, and I would not want to be caught saying X and it turns out to be Z.
Right.
Based on what we see now, here's how it looks to me, and I say this tentatively. There are those people, there are those young people. They've actually been around for a very long time. There's a book from 2002 by Colleen Campbell called The Young Faithful that documents exactly this. In the early 20th century, there was a Catholic renaissance of all these amazing writers who were mostly European and British, but Yeah, so that goes on. My question as a sociologist, and I hate to be a pain here, but my question is, how many of them are there? Like,
Yeah,
we know that young committed Catholics are more conservative, traditional, and committed in some way. Well, I won't use the word committed, more traditional conservative than baby boomer, Vatican II era Catholics. Like, that's going on. But how many are there? What effect will they have organizationally? The second point is, even if that's a movement, and I don't really mean to be a wet blanket, but even if that's a movement that gets going, there's still the larger question of the larger culture, the deep cultural. How do you get from sort of a vanguard of thoughtful, spiritually tuned in people who are, get more serious and committed to a broader population, if that's your goal? Maybe that's not somebody's goal, but there's still the broader culture that is still profoundly affected by the internet, social media. Now, who knows what AI, robotics are going to bring? Like, the big forces at work in the social context still got to be reckoned with. So far be it from me to say something interesting and something profound couldn't happen. But when we look at what we know now, in my observation and what I hear, religious leaders are so desperate for any good news that if somebody anywhere says, yeah, younger men are returning to church now, like, they jump all over that, like, hopefully there's something there because the
right.
news has been bad for so long. And then journalists play into that too, because journalists can't have the same headline year after year. They're always looking for something new and surprising to say. But sociologically, we have to, put our feet on the ground and say, okay, what are the numbers? Where is this going? What does it mean? What impact could it have, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah. So, bottom line, Christian Smith, I have, um, I'm struggling to come up myself with a bottom line that is not fairly discouraging for the future of the church, even the evangelical church, of which I consider myself a part. Um, on the other hand, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Right? In other words, it feels to me that there is so much truth in what you're saying that even if I find the news that you're bringing me discouraging, that it would not be prudent, not be wise to ignore that. So, so where am I? What do I do?
Yeah, so here's what I would say. Well, first of all, I'm not in the business of giving answers. I'm not a church consultant or whatever, but I would say from my book's perspective, a few things. First of all, this is not the first time in Christian history when things have been tough, when the current's been going the opposite direction. I think those who are committed to their faith traditions will say, things go up, things go down. It's not all going to go under. Secondly, to echo what you just said, as long as if people are sort of living in wishful thinking, that's not going to help anything. Like, to not understand what's really going on is just going to make things worse. So I think that the constructive contribution of my book is really like helping people understand the larger context, the reality. I don't think there's any simple, easy solutions. I don't have any ideas in my head about what to do, but I think understanding what one is facing is the first step in a longer term sorting things out. The third thing I would say, and that is, this may be some comfort to particular people in the clergy, for example. Um, I've given early on in this project, I gave a talk on this to at Emory University and at the theology school, and some Methodist clergy showed up, and they were about to retire, and they came up to me afterwards and said, "Thank you. Thank you so much. We thought we had completely screwed up our ministry. Like, things have not been going well, and we thought it was our fault." So I
Yeah.
think one of the functions of my book is to help people realize, especially people in ministry, like, yeah, you matter, what you do matters, but there's a lot more than just what you do. There's a huge context, there's a sweeping history here that you're operating within. So if nothing else, I think it can give a perspective to help people who may blame themselves literally for not having succeeded in doing what they thought they should do, to understand the larger forces at work, and then to be able to step back and say, what could we have done differently, and what might we do differently in the future, given those larger contextual forces, so that our particular personal ministry and work would be more effective somehow. So
Yeah.
again, it's the context setting, I think, helps people get a perspective that's got to be helpful,
Yeah.
even if
Well,
it's
Dr.
not
Christian,
encouraging. Yeah.
Dr. Christian Smith, thank you so much for being on the program today. I found your book nourishing. I found this conversation to be nourishing as well. I'm grateful. And yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. It was a fun conversation.